The sun had barely risen over the quiet town of Gunjur when Aisha stood by the wooden table, carefully folding her daughter Fatima's new uniform. Her hands trembled slightly, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of what today meant. Fatima, her only daughter, was going to school for the first time. Aisha had fought against tradition, against the whispers of neighbors, against even her own husband's doubts to make this moment possible. "Mama, do you think I will be smart enough?" Fatima asked, her voice small but eager. Aisha knelt, holding her daughter's face in her hands. "You are already smart, my love. Education will only help the world see it." Her words were firm, but deep inside, she feared what lay ahead. She had heard the cruel stories, girls harassed on their way to school, teachers who dismissed their questions, families who pulled them out before they could dream too big. But she had also seen the light in Fatima's eyes, a hunger for knowledge that no fear could extinguish. As she adjusted the strap on Fatima's bag, she whispered a silent prayer. Let her be safe. Let her be strong. That morning, as Fatima walked toward the schoolhouse, Aisha watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with both pride and worry. She knew this was just the beginning of a battle that many mothers before her had lost. But she refused to let her daughter be another forgotten name. The walk to school was short, but for Fatima, it felt like a journey into another world. The streets buzzed with life, vendors shouting their prices, children laughing as they ran past, women balancing baskets on their heads. But amidst the noise, there was an underlying tension. Fatima noticed the stares, the disapproving glances from older men and women who still believed a girl's place was at home. She clutched her books tighter, determined not to let their judgment shake her resolve. When she reached the school gates, she took a deep breath and stepped inside. The classroom was filled with new faces, some friendly, some indifferent. The teacher, an elderly man with kind but tired eyes, welcomed her. "We have a new student today," he announced. "Fatima Musa." The room erupted into whispers. Fatima could hear some of the boys snickering, but she lifted her chin high. She had waited for this moment for too long to let fear take hold. She found a seat next to a girl who offered a shy smile. "I'm Mariam," she whispered. "Welcome." The first week of school was a dream for Fatima. She loved the way letters turned into words, how numbers danced across the board, how books smelled of endless possibilities. But it didn't take long for reality to sink in. "Hey, schoolgirl, what's the point? You'll be cooking for your husband in a few years anyway." A group of boys sneered as she walked past them. Fatima clenched her fists, but kept walking. "Ignore them," she whispered to herself. But their laughter followed her like a shadow. Inside the classroom, it wasn't much better. The teacher barely noticed the girls, calling only on the boys to answer questions. When Fatima bravely raised her hand, she was met with a dismissive wave. "Let the boys handle the tough ones." She wanted to scream. Instead, she thought of her mother's words, "Knowledge is power." She wouldn't give up. But the hardest moment came when Mariam, her best friend, whispered in trembling words, "Fatima, this is my last day. My father is marrying me off next week." "No," Fatima gasped, gripping Mariam's hands. "You can't leave. We were going to finish school together." Tears filled Mariam's eyes. "I don't have a choice." Fatima watched as her friend walked away, her future sealed by the will of others. That night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she made a vow. She would never let anyone take her dreams away. One evening, Fatima walked home alone, the weight of her books heavy on her back. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. She quickened her pace, aware of the silence creeping in. Suddenly, a rustling in the bushes made her freeze. "Where are you rushing to, schoolgirl?" A voice slithered through the air. Her heart pounded. She turned to see a group of older boys, their eyes dark with mischief. Fear gripped her, but she stood tall. "I need to get home," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. One of them stepped closer. "Why don't you stay and chat? You don't have to be in such a hurry." Before she could respond, she heard another voice, loud, commanding. "Fatima, there you are!" She turned to see her older cousin Ibrahim striding toward them. The boys scattered like leaves in the wind. Fatima let out a shaky breath. When she got home, she ran into her mother's arms. "Mama, I was so scared." Aisha held her tightly, tears slipping down her face. "This is why we must fight, Fatima. No girl should have to feel this way just for wanting an education." The next day, Aisha gathered other mothers and demanded the school a years passed, and Fatima's journey was filled with challenges. But she never wavered. With every book she read, every case she studied, she edged closer to her dream. The streets of Gunjur had once whispered doubts about her future, but now they spoke of her as a force of change. At the university, Fatima met other young women who had faced similar struggles. They shared stories of resistance, of fathers who doubted them, of brothers who told them education was useless, of communities that refused to see their worth. But together, they formed a sisterhood, a bond stronger than fear. They studied late into the night, pushing each other forward, determined to prove the world wrong. One evening, as she sat beneath a tree on campus, flipping through her law books, a familiar voice called her name. She turned to see Mariam, the friend she had lost to an early marriage, standing before her. "Mariam?" Fatima gasped, rising to her feet. Tears welled in Mariam's eyes as she rushed to embrace Fatima. "I never thought I'd see you again," she whispered. Fatima pulled back, scanning her friend's face. She looked older than her years, worn by a life she had not chosen. "What happened?" Mariam sighed. "I did as my father wished. I married, I bore children, but I never forgot what we dreamed of. And now, I want to fight for my daughters. I don't want them to suffer as I did." Fatima took Mariam's hands in hers. "Then fight with me." That night, they talked for hours, Mariam sharing her struggles, and Fatima listening with the heart of a future lawyer. She knew Mariam's story was not unique. There were many girls like her, forced into lives they were not ready for. It only fueled Fatima's resolve. By the time Fatima completed her law degree, she had already begun working with women's organizations, advocating for policies that protected girls from child marriage and ensured their right to education. She traveled from village to village, speaking to parents, urging them to see the future their daughters deserved. Musa, once a skeptic, now stood beside her. He spoke to fathers, sharing his transformation, telling them of the pride he felt in his daughter. "I almost let tradition rob me of my greatest blessing," he would say. "Don't make the same mistake." The little girl who had once feared walking home alone now stood before government officials, demanding change. She fought in courtrooms, she gave speeches, she refused to be silenced. One day, years later, as Fatima stepped into her office, a young girl waited for her, clutching a letter in her hands. "Miss Fatima," the girl said shyly, "I wrote an essay about you in school. You're my hero." Fatima knelt before her, smiling. "And one day, you'll be someone else's hero." As the sun set over Gunjur, Fatima knew her journey was far from over. But she also knew she was not alone. The fight for education, for justice, for a future where every girl could dream and achieve, this was her life's purpose, and she would never stop fighting. Fatima's tireless efforts began to transform not only her community, but the entire nation. Laws that once restricted girls' access to education were slowly being amended. More fathers were listening to her story, understanding that the future of their daughters was far brighter with an education in hand. One day, she was invited to speak at a national conference on women's rights. As she stood before the audience, a flood of memories rushed through her, of the little girl who was once dismissed, of the teenage girl who walked to school despite the insults, and of the young woman who had fought every obstacle that stood in her way. She had come so far, but she knew the work was not done. I stand here today not just as a lawyer, but as a daughter, as a mother, as a woman who knows the value of education, Fatima said, her voice steady and powerful. I am proof that when you invest in a girl, you are investing in the future. We are not the burden we are sometimes made out to be. We are the change, the hope, the future of a better world. The crowd was silent, the weight of her words settling in. Then a slow, steady applause began, growing louder and louder until it filled the hall. Fatima knew that this was more than a victory for her. It was a victory for every girl who had been told she couldn't, for every mother who had fought for her daughter's future. As she left the stage, she was met by a group of young girls, their eyes shining with admiration. One of them stepped forward, a notebook in hand. "Miss Fatima," she said, "I want to be just like you when I grow up." Fatima smiled and knelt down. "You already are, my dear. You just don't know it yet." Years later, when Fatima had children of her own, she would tell them stories of how she fought for every girl's right to an education. She would remind them that the path to success was never easy, but it was always worth it.